Our next special guest is Dr. Samantha Pillay. Dr. Pillay became the first urologist in Australia to exclusively specialise in female and functional urology, establishing Continence Matters in 2002, subsequently building her single surgeon practice into a centre of excellence. Her vision was to establish a subspecialty practice bringing the best treatments available to the women of South Australia. Samantha has devoted her career as a surgeon to treating incontinence, reducing the stigma and educating doctors, health professionals and the community, and was a nominee for the South Australian of the Year in 2022. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Samantha Pillay to share her story.
Wow, what a great view from up here. You guys can't see it, but you look amazing. Interestingly, the last time I gave a talk at the convention centre, it was on recurrent urinary tract infections. So you'll be pleased that that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. And thank you, Showcase SA, for asking me to come and speak to you about a topic near and dear to my heart. And what an honour to have been included in what an impressive lineup that we've had today. So it's about breaking the bias, and I thought the best thing that I could do today is, my message is I want you to think about this in your life and what you can do and what part you might play as an individual, either through a conscious or unconscious bias, rather than having that thought, oh, it's something for government, it's something for my employer, it's something for my business. Rather than something out there, I'd like you to think about the part that you might play. And probably the best way that I can do that is just share with you my experiences as the first female to do urological surgical training in South Australia, and my journey and how things have changed. So I was a medical student in the 1980s, and at that time already half of the medical students were female, but it was very unusual to do surgery. Less than 4% of the surgeons in Australia and New Zealand were female. And what I found as a medical student, the response I got was not the same as my male colleagues. I didn't get the same encouragement or admiration. I got curious questioning, like, why don't you want children? So I actually learned, because when you're a medical student, it's the first thing everyone says, what do you do when you finish? I learned to qualify my answer, and I said, I want to be a surgeon and I don't want to have kids. Now, having finished school at 16 and then going straight into medical school, that definitely was not on my radar at that stage of my life. When I started my surgical training, and I was working at the Royal Adelaide, on the old Royal Adelaide, on a Friday night we'd often head across the road to the Botanic Hotel for drinks. And I'd be there with my male colleagues, and I'd hear them talking to a young girl at the bar, and the conversation would be around, oh, what do you do? And they'd say, I'm a surgeon. And I'd be like, what? Not I'm a trainee, not I'm a registrar. They'd say, I'm a surgeon. And they would actually get the response that they wanted. Yet, dating in Adelaide in the early 90s, that wasn't the response that I got. It was sort of a conversation killer. I got a few curious questions and then the guy would move on. So I learnt to lie. I used to make up things. I wouldn't tell guys what I did. I'd just lie and choose a typical female gendered stereotype. So when I was doing my training, I never had the opportunity to work on a surgical unit with a female surgeon. There were a few in Adelaide, but not many. There were a few surgical registrars, but we didn't really have a cohesive, supportive group. We were exhausted, trying to keep our head above water, and scattered across various teaching hospitals. So it wasn't actually until I'd finished 14 years of training and I had actually become a surgeon as a woman that I went to work with Professor Helen O'Connell in Melbourne, who was a fantastic mentor. And it was the first time in my life that I was ever in the operating room operating on a patient with another female consultant, even though I'd become one. So Helen, I was the first for South Australia. Helen was the first for the whole of Australia and New Zealand to train in urology. She started her training 5 years before me. So in 1991, we had this meeting, we still have this meeting, it's called USANZ, Urological Society of Australia and New Zealand. We have a scientific meeting, so when it's in Adelaide it would be here every year, which is an academic program. In actual fact, in 2007, I became the first woman to be the scientific convener of that meeting in its history. But in 1991, when Helen started on the program, they had the formal lunch like this as part of the program. And so the entertainment for that lunch was not a talk on gender bias. They had, you won't believe it, a bikini parade. So things were very different, okay? Things have changed, but that's what it was like. I now work as a consultant at Calvary Hospital, but when I was a registrar, going there, we only had one lithotripsy machine in South Australia, and I used to go there as a registrar to operate. So I rock up at Calvary, and I go upstairs to get changed, and the surgeons' change rooms, there's surgeons, there's the doctor's change room, and the nurse's change room. So the doctor's change room at the hospital was for the men, and the nurse's change room was for the women. Now, doing urology, you know, I used to get called the dick doctor, so you might have thought I was qualified to use the doctor's change room, but no, I had to change in the nurse's change room. So they have, I can assure you now, changed the names on the change rooms. So what was it like? How did the doctors treat me? In theatre, the conversation evolved around football, golf, wine and women. So I didn't really feel like I had a lot to connect with. Outside of clinical conversations, I felt that the conversation was a bit awkward, not intentionally. It almost seemed like maybe there were men who had grown up in a private all-boys school in Adelaide, gone into a profession that was all men, and had very little skills about how to converse with a woman in a leadership position, in a senior position. There's a lot of networking, so it's a profession, and just like a lot of professions, there's a lot of stuff that's not part of the formal academic program. So I felt like I missed out on a lot of the networking, things like, you know, how you set up private practice, how you run a business, where you get your information from, introductions, and various things like that. When we had functions, they would address the surgeons and their wives. They would welcome the surgeons and their wives. At the end of the year, we'd have a function. They'd thank the surgeons and their wives for their support. We'd have an academic program, and then there'd be a partners program where a bus would take the wives shopping. So it was a very gender-biased environment. The social functions at night, you know, there'd be bands, a lot of music, a lot of drinking, and a lot of times that would be where the guys would let their guard down. Now, as a female, that would be the time where my guard would go up. I would find I had to reduce how much I drank, had to be careful what I said, I had to be cautious about what I wore. I eventually stopped drinking at these functions. I actually eventually stopped going for many years. The tradition at the end of the night, when the function finished, would be to head off to a strip club. So the culture or the environment was a very different place. How did the nurses treat me? So the nurses, I found, were very, very excited to find out the surgical rotations for who was going to be the surgical registrars coming to their ward. And when I was always worried that I was a real disappointment for them when they found out they were getting a female, because they seemed to lust after many of the surgical registrars, and some of them ended up marrying them. So I was always worried that it was a bit of a disappointment when they found out they were getting a female. I did feel that the behaviour that was expected and looked up to from my male colleagues was thought of as aggressive or unfeminine or assertive but the same behaviour by me. And I definitely felt like my authority was challenged a lot more. What about the patients? How did the patients treat me? Well, the big thing with the patients was something called role misidentification. It was hard enough for them to believe that I was the doctor, let alone the surgeon. So that often was, again, another area of curious questioning. You know, what are you doing? Why did you choose surgery? You know, don't you want to have a family? Type of things. So the role misidentification, though, was in my early career and my training not something that would happen occasionally. I'm talking about every single patient. I'm talking about 50 times a day. I'm talking about relentless and exhausting. I'm not talking about hundreds. I'm talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of times. And that did have an impact. It could mean the difference between your male colleague getting out of clinic faster and getting through their patients faster, getting to theatre before you and getting to scrub in and getting a better training experience. So they were the sorts of challenges that I faced. Now, one of the, and I'm going to actually walk across and try and walk across without limping, because that's what I've been practicing over the last 4 years. But usually when I walk, people pick up my limp. So that gender was not my only barrier. So I was born with congenital hip dysplasia that wasn't picked up as a child. And so I had quite a lot of pain, a lot of mobility issues. And in my 20s, I was too young for a hip replacement with the way that the hip replacements were, you know, back then, more than 25 years ago. So what happened was I had to do a lot of work. I had to spend hours every week swimming, Pilates, training like Kayla, but not with the result that she would get, I'm sure, just to be able to work, drive and function. Now, with the 100 hours a week and the 36-hour continuous shifts, I wasn't able to keep up. And so things got behind and I got more and more pain, my mobility got worse and worse. And it actually all came to a head when I developed some numbness and paralysis. I was general surgical registrar on the colorectal unit at the Royal Adelaide, and I saw a neurosurgeon who said that encouragingly they thought I had a spinal tumour, and I was rushed into an MRI in the middle of the day. Now, fortunately, that was not the case. It was all just due to deconditioning, but it brought things to a head, and I thought to myself, well, if I finish my surgical training and have a little bit more control over my hours, I'll see if I can go part-time and just work 40 hours a week. So I sort of put forward this proposal to be the very first female from Australia and New Zealand to do surgical training part-time with a 40-hour-a-week roster, roughly. Found another doctor to job share, had letters from the sort of emerging women in surgery committee at my neurosurgeon and my orthopaedic surgeon, and I was flatly refused. I was told that there was no way a profession like surgery could be trained part-time, 40 hours a week. So I muddled through my training because although I had well-meaning people telling me that I could take the College of Surgeons to the federal court in Australia, in my 20s that was not going to be a move that I wanted to make, and definitely I thought career ending. So I managed to get through my training, and then some of you may be aware that what's become probably a note of prestige when you finish your training as a surgeon, you change your name to Mr. Now, that wasn't going to help. I was still unmarried at that time. Calling myself Miss was not going to help with my role misidentification. So I decided to stay Doctor. What else? Yes, I was given a good advice. So private practice is a business just like anything else, even for surgeons, and it's a very competitive area. So I was told by my male colleagues that because I was a woman, I shouldn't do private practice. There are two reasons. One is you'll need maternity leave, and so you need to be a public employee in the public system so that you can have a year of what was then unpaid maternity leave. I was also told that I couldn't be on call for private patients as a mother. So, but I failed to realise how being on call for a public patient was any different. So I ended up establishing my own private practice. I was in private practice and also working in public as well. I'd been in practice for 5 years when I had my son, and I went back to work when he was 6 weeks of age, taking him to work with me every day. And when I went back to work, I got the capsule out the back seat when I'm at work, and I'm in the car park, and one of the nurses comes running up to me. I'm thinking, oh my God, what's happened to one of my patients? Excuse me, you can't park here. These parks are for doctors. So I had to come to terms with now, I'd been parking the same spot for 5 years, but now I was not just a woman, I was a mother. So when I took my son everywhere with me, I was the first woman that I ever saw. I was the first female to represent South Australia on the board of urology, and I was the first female I ever saw take my son into board meetings, take him into the scientific programs and various committees that I was on. When he was 2, I was invited to give the keynote speech at the New Zealand urology meeting. And so they flew me over. I didn't need a ticket for him because he was young enough that he didn't need one. And I found a name of a babysitter from one of the other surgeons and organised a babysitter to come and look after him while I gave a keynote speech. Now, if any of you can imagine what it's like to negotiate with a 2-year-old when you're in a meeting like this and all eyes are upon you, he wouldn't even sit in the front row with the babysitter. So I ended up having to give my keynote speech behind the podium with, a 2-year-old, arms gripped tightly round my leg and tugging me while I tried not to lose my place. And every now and then he'd peep out from behind the podium. I'd only been a consultant for, 7 years. I was still fairly junior, and I was acutely embarrassed and thought this was an absolute huge disaster after they'd paid and flown me over to New Zealand. I was very touched, though, because even still today, I've had a young woman come up to me and say, what an important role modelling that was for them at the time. I didn't realise the history I was making. So it's been a very interesting journey. The College of Surgeons has actually done a lot to change the culture in surgery. And they have a lot on their agenda, and they have a lot of goals. So they are working very hard, and things are different. In 2015, they commissioned a report and that found that 49% of trainees experienced bullying, discrimination and sexual harassment. So there's been a lot of spotlight put on this area. And in actual fact, this morning I spoke at an International Women's Day event for the College of Surgeons in Canberra. So this is my second talk today, as luckily the plane was fine, getting me here on time. So one of the things people say is, do you think you have to be better as a woman to succeed? And, obviously I'd like to think so. But it's very interesting. There's an article that's just been published in JAMA, the Journal for the American Medical Association, from Canadian group only a couple of months ago. They looked at thousands and thousands and thousands of patients, and they interestingly found that when a female patient was operated on by a male surgeon, compared to when they were operated on by a female surgeon, they had a 15% higher complication rate and a 30% higher mortality rate. Now, that's quite an alarming figures, and we're yet to fully really understand why, because they did correct for a lot of factors. But the important to diversity is the ability for people to connect with their audience, whether a patient, and there's a lot of theories as to why that might be the case. I think it does remind me of that quote, and I don't know where it comes from, but you have to remember, Ginger Rogers danced like Fred Astaire, only backwards and in high heels. So what I'd like to finish with today is just reminding you that gender bias creates barriers for some people, but not for others. And I've had a fantastic career, but I can't help but wonder, could I have actually done even more? So I'd leave you today with thinking about the biases, conscious and unconscious, that you might come across, the difference that you can make, and the barriers that it might create for opportunities for your children or your friends or your family or the people that you care about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is fascinating listening to you talk about how everything has changed so much. I know everyone here is really fascinated to learn about what you're doing because it is so unique. But what a lot of people might not realise, and I mean it was up on the screen before, is that you're a best-selling author. And I actually had my team write a story about you before I had the chance to meet you, because Samantha's written these incredible books, which are children's books, but they are very unique. And I want to sort of start by asking you about, what made you go into this space, and if you could explain what the books are to everyone here, and talk about why you chose those subjects.
Yes, so the first, it's Inspirational Careers for Kids. So the first book, When I'm a Surgeon, obviously, it's pretty easy to see where I got that from. It's self-belief and self-efficacy for children is fundamental to achieving goals. So our speakers earlier touched on, Tammy was talking about her father. That fundamental self-belief is absolutely essential. And at an early age, you need that self-belief to then overcome any barriers. The career gender biases, they also start to form at about age 3. We talk about career guidance in senior school. It's way too late. Girls have decided what girls do and boys have decided what boys do, related to family, personal experiences, media, books. And so breaking those career gender stereotypes and building that self-efficacy in small children is where you need to start. So I wanted to create the books. The books are for the child's imagination to imagine themselves in that role. I don't want every girl to become a surgeon or every kid. I want every kid to believe that they could become a surgeon if they wanted to. So that's the idea of the Inspirational Careers for Kids books, like with all things that start off, that gets bigger and bigger. So the second book, When I'm an Entrepreneur, my other second love is business. But I was actually here last week for the Australian Space Forum, because the current one I'm working on at the moment is When I'm an Astronaut. The main character is a girl in each of these books. So they really are normalising these careers for girls, and hopefully for the adults buying the books and reading the books for them as well. So that's where I felt that I was going to get the most bang for my buck as far as my time and energy in trying to make a difference in this space. My other book, the No Recipe Cookbook, doesn't actually have to do with gender bias, but my other big passion is health and lifestyle. And I had so many patients with stress over time management, financial management and weight control. And I felt that, so the No Recipe Cookbook is really about cooking without a recipe. It's the anti-celebrity chef kitchen show to try and get people that live on takeaway to eat healthy, just simple food prepared at home. No pictures, no recipes. It's a completely different area.
Sounds like something I need. My husband does all the cooking, so thank you, Steve. So looking back through the career that you've had, do you have any advice that you'll give to your younger self?
Probably the most important thing I would say is dream bigger, aim higher. So the dedication for my children's book series is to all children to dream big and aim high. Role models are really, really important, and you can't be what you can't see. So I didn't even have that vision as a child. That's the vision I want children to have. And so dream bigger, aim higher. Whatever you're planning on doing, I would say to a child, double it and then double it again. Don't dare to dream big.
Excellent, thank you. Now, the next big question when you're working, your aspiration was a 40-hour part-time week. How do you achieve work-life balance?
So I'm a workaholic. I love work. It's all work, whether it's housework, whether it's homework, whether it's parent work, or whether it's surgical work, or whether it's business work. So I think the separation of this work-life balance, I was brought up with this idea that you control your work so you have enough time for your family. I think that's a very male model to separate it. For me, work-life balance is having a job where I have autonomy and control and flexibility. I can take school holidays off. I can book the sports day off if I want. I can go in late if there's something on. So working for myself and from an entrepreneur point of view, that's been very important. Taking my son in to work with me, taking him to board meetings. And I mean, I've written some articles which are on my website, and one of them is surgery is often seen as the worst career for a woman in medicine, and one of the articles I've written is why it's actually the best career. And it's not just about being able to afford a cleaner or something. It's about my son has preparing for a public speaking competition. He's been dragged around to conferences his whole life. When he was 3 and I went to pick him up from, the kindy teacher said, your 3-year-old today sat down and put all the toys around and said he was having a board meeting. So the soft skills that he's developed, the leadership skills, whether it's negotiating, whether it's public speaking, emotional intelligence, there's been a huge advantage that my work has given him. So for me, the work-life balance is about bringing my family life to work and my work life to family, and not separating them.
Great, thank you. Now, as a trailblazer, what do you think can be done to address gender stereotyping in the broader community?
Read my book. I think role model is really important. So what role models do is it breaks stereotypes and it changes the way people think about people in different roles and creates diversity. So that role modelling and how that is often portrayed, the media have a very big role in that, but you are the consumer, and so as the consumer, if you demand that from your businesses, if you consume that in your interests, those providers, business media, will deliver because you're the end user. So I think, and that's what Showcase SA has done today. Look, you're here listening to me, so.
Excellent. And we're running a little bit over time, so sort of to wrap this up, I'd really like to know, if you have advice for our audience today, what would you suggest they do to help follow their dreams?
Don't be afraid to dream. That's the first thing. Don't be afraid to dream. You have a dream of getting from A to B. The difficult question is, how do you get from A to B? And invest in yourself, so the skills that you, everything that you do, whether it has a good result or a bad result, everything that happens to you, whether that's good or bad, utilise that to advance your skills. Whether you have a clear strategy, if I didn't have gender barriers and I had role models and I had a clear vision, I reckon I could have achieved a lot more with laser focus. That wasn't what I had. It doesn't mean it was wrong, but it was it was still trailblazing for its time, but would maybe not so now. But if you're just following the breadcrumbs, then that's also a really good way to go as well. Just follow the breadcrumbs. And the other thing is go for the low-hanging fruit. Knock them off first.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Could everyone please put their hands together for Dr. Samantha Pillay? Thank you so much for coming in, and I'm so glad you caught that flight. That's absolute multitasking there, going to Canberra for breakfast and being here by lunch. So thank you for making the time.